Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. If these stories bring you comfort, you're welcome to subscribe and join us on these quiet journeys. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. In the dim, hushed confines of a modest room nestled within the labyrinthine streets of London's East End, Thomas Wickham found himself enveloped in a quietude that seemed to cling to the very air, like the oppressive fog that pressed against the window panes with insistent persistence. The hour was late, though not yet so late as to chase all honest folk from the streets, and the lamplighter stood before his small mirror, adjusting the brass buttons of his coat with fingers made nimble by years of practice. His reflection, ghostly and indistinct in the wavering candlelight, showed a man neither young nor old, his face marked by the gentle weathering of one who spent his evenings walking the city's thoroughfares in rain and wind and snow alike. The distant rhythmic clatter of horse hooves upon cobblestones floated up from the street below, creating an echoing cadence that merged with the ticking of the clock, each tick marking time in a life that stretched through the London nights like a measured thread of light against the gathering darkness. Thomas fastened the final button and reached for his long pole, its brass fittings gleaming faintly in the dim room, the tool of his trade worn smooth by countless evenings of service. The pole stood taller than himself, a faithful companion in his nightly rounds, as familiar to his hands as his own walking stick might have been to a gentleman of leisure. He paused momentarily, peering through the window beyond which the city lay shrouded in mist, a spectral world of muted outlines and softened edges, where the gas lamps he would soon tend stood sentinel against the encroaching night. His breath fogged the glass, blurring the already indistinct shapes of buildings and alleyways that made up the familiar landscape of his evening domain. The fog had seeped inside, it seemed, blurring the boundaries between his thoughts and the tangible world, between duty and something deeper, something that called to him on these cold December nights. The gaslight above him sputtered with a gentle persistence, casting a warm but uncertain light that echoed the flickers of memory and purpose that stirred within his breast. His life, so neatly ordered and predictable, stretched before him like the streets he walked each evening, a path well trodden and devoid of surprise. And yet, within him stirred a satisfaction, a quiet pride in the work that kept the darkness at bay for those who huddled in their homes or hurried through the foggy streets. The monotony of his rounds, with their endless succession of lamps to light and wicks to tend, seemed to whisper to him of a life well lived, a purpose clearly defined. And so, with a familiar resolve born of habit and dedication, Thomas prepared to venture out into the night, to allow the cool embrace of the fog and the quietude of the sleeping city to accompany him on his appointed rounds. He moved with deliberation, retrieving his worn leather satchel from its accustomed place, checking that it contained the necessary items: matches wrapped carefully in waxed cloth, a small tin of oil for stubborn wicks, a cloth for cleaning the glass chimneys. The act of preparation, simple though it was, carried with it a sense of ritual, a determination to fulfill his duty with the care it deserved. As he turned the key in the lock and stepped over the threshold, the gaslight in his room flickered once more, as if bidding him farewell, its light briefly illuminating the small chamber he left behind, a sanctuary of ordered simplicity now abandoned to silence until his return near dawn. The door clicked shut with a quiet finality, and Thomas descended the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing softly in the confined space, each step an affirmation of purpose, until he emerged into the street where the fog clung like a spectral cloak, transforming the familiar into something mysterious and new. The gas lamps lining the thoroughfare stood sentinel in their iron brackets, waiting for his arrival like faithful servants awaiting their master's command. Their unlit globes seemed to watch him with patient expectation as he approached the first of many that would mark his evening's journey through the city's heart. The cobblestones beneath his feet were slick with moisture, the city's breath a gentle whisper that wound its way through the alleys and lanes, carrying with it the myriad scents and sounds of a metropolis settling into its nocturnal rhythms. As Thomas extended his pole toward the first lamp, the world around him seemed to hold its breath, a tableau of muted colors and softened edges, where the familiar became mysterious and the night beckoned with a quiet allure. The distant chime of a clock tower marked the passage of time with a solemn dignity, its echoes mingling with the sound of his own measured footsteps, and with the fog as his companion and the gaslight his purpose. Thomas Wickham ventured forth into the night, his heart steady with the knowledge that his work brought light to the darkness, transforming the city streets into pathways of safety and comfort for all who traveled them. Out into the mist-shrouded evening, Thomas stepped with a practiced certainty, his senses attuned to the whispering secrets of the night that had become as familiar to him as the rooms of his own modest dwelling. The dense fog clung to him like a spectral shroud, wrapping the cobbled streets in its soft embrace, rendering familiar outlines into phantoms of their former selves, yet not obscuring them entirely from eyes that had learned to read the darkness. The gas lamps, their warm glow about to spring forth at his ministrations, would soon cast pools of golden light that danced upon the slick stones, creating an ethereal tapestry of shadow and luminescence that transformed London's streets into a realm of quiet beauty. Each step he took was accompanied by the gentle echo of his boots, a comforting rhythm that harmonized with the distant, melancholy tolling of a church bell, its sonorous clang reverberating through the silent thoroughfares, marking the slow passage of time with the measured dignity of ages. The usual cacophony of the city, with its bustling crowds and clattering carriages, seemed to have retreated into the depths of evening, leaving behind a serene stillness that was both unsettling in its completeness and intriguing in its promise of revelation. In this transformed landscape, Thomas found his perceptions heightened, each detail magnified by the obscuring fog and the anticipation of the work ahead. The grand facades of the Victorian architecture, with their intricate carvings and ornate stonework, seemed to loom larger, their features softened, yet made more mysterious by the veil of mist that clung to every surface. Archways and columns appeared as solemn sentinels, guarding the secrets of the ages, their silence speaking volumes to the attentive ear, telling tales of the countless souls who had passed beneath them in times of prosperity and hardship alike. Thomas approached his first lamp of the evening, a stately iron post that stood at the corner where Cheapside met the narrow lane that led towards the river. He had lit this particular lamp on countless nights, knew its peculiarities and moods as a shepherd knows each sheep in his flock. The brass fittings, though tarnished by weather and time, still gleamed faintly in the dying light of day, and the glass globe, recently cleaned by his own hand during yesterday's rounds, awaited the flame that would transform it from mere metal and glass into a beacon of hope and safety. With the deft movements born of long practice, Thomas raised his pole, its hook engaging the mechanism that would open the lamp's small door. The action was smooth, requiring neither force nor hesitation, a ballet of tool and lamp that he had performed so many times it had become second nature. He struck a match, its sudden flare brilliant against the gathering gloom, and touched it to the gas jet. The lamp caught immediately, the flame springing to life with a soft whoosh that never failed to bring him a small measure of satisfaction, a confirmation that all was well, that his work was proceeding as it should. The light spread outward in expanding circles, pushing back the fog and darkness, creating a small island of visibility in the sea of mist. The street beneath the lamp came into focus. The worn cobblestones, the water standing in shallow puddles from an earlier rain, the facade of the tobacconist's shop with its painted sign barely visible through the gloom. One lamp lit, many more to go, each adding its small contribution to the safety and comfort of London's nighttime streets. Thomas moved onward, his pace measured and unhurried, but there was no benefit in rushing through work that demanded precision and care. The fog thickened as he progressed deeper into the older quarters of the city, where buildings leaned close together as if sharing secrets, and the streets narrowed into passages barely wide enough for a cart to navigate. Here the darkness was more profound, the need for his lights more pressing, and he attended to each lamp with the same careful attention he had given to the first. As he worked, figures emerged from the mist like shadows given temporary substance, dark silhouettes that flitted past with ghostly grace. Here, a clerk hurrying home to his supper, his ledger tucked beneath one arm. There, a woman with a basket, the hem of her dress whispering secrets to the cobblestones as she passed. These fleeting glimpses stirred Thomas's imagination, each person a story unto themselves, each journey through the fog-laden streets a chapter in the vast novel that was London itself. The fog-laden streets seemed to conspire with the night, guiding Thomas with an unseen hand, each turn revealing yet another alley, another row of lamps awaiting his attention. The very air was thick with possibilities, each corner promising the continuation of his work, the steady progression through the city that gave structure and meaning to his evenings. The gaslight flickered invitingly as he worked, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the narrow paths, beckoning him onward into the heart of his route. The city, with its myriad secrets and hidden corners, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, inviting the curious and the dedicated to participate in its nocturnal rhythms. And Thomas, with his pole and his matches and his quiet dedication, was an essential part of that life, a guardian of the light that kept the darkness from overwhelming those who depended upon the safety of illuminated streets. The distant bell tolled once more, its echo a gentle reminder of the hour. Yet time seemed to lose its urgency in this dreamlike realm, where fog and gaslight wove a spell that drew him ever deeper into his work. Each step was a step into the familiar unknown, a surrender to the routine that paradoxically brought newness with each evening's journey. Each lamp lit another small victory against the encroaching night. As he rounded yet another corner, the fog parted briefly, revealing a row of shops shuttered for the evening, their windows dark but their presence somehow comforting in its solidity. Thomas worked his way along the row, lighting each lamp with the same measured care, and as each light sprang forth, the street transformed from a place of shadows into a thoroughfare where late travelers could walk with confidence, and where those who looked out from upper windows could see the reassuring glow that said all was well in their corner of the great city, in the midst of the veiled and winding streets, where the cobblestones seemed to whisper beneath Thomas's feet with the accumulated memory of countless footfalls. There emerged a figure, standing with an air of uncertain grace beneath one of the lamps he had only moments before lit. The scene was set with the kind of quietude that one might expect in the repose between the city's bustling heartbeats, and yet within that silence there was an unmistakable quality of expectation, as if this encounter had been written in some invisible script that governed the movements of their lives. The figure was that of a young woman, her silhouette outlined with such precision against the lamp's glow that she appeared almost ethereal, as if conjured by the gaslight itself to provide a moment of human connection in Thomas's solitary rounds. Her shawl, wrapped tightly against the evening chill, was of good quality but showed signs of careful mending, speaking of genteel circumstances, perhaps recently diminished, yet maintained with dignity and pride. Thomas, with a heart stirred by both an inexplicable fascination and a gentle propriety befitting his station, paused in his work, his pole held loosely at his side as he regarded the young woman with cautious attention. She appeared to be waiting for someone, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded street with an expression that mingled hope and apprehension in equal measure. "Good evening, miss," Thomas spoke at last, his voice carrying a respectful tone that seemed to float upon the night air, each word carefully measured, yet touched with a warmth that came naturally to one whose work brought comfort to others. "The fog grows thick this evening. Might I be of assistance in any way?" The young woman turned towards him, her face becoming visible in the lamp's glow. She was perhaps 20 years of age, with features that spoke of intelligence and determination, though shadowed now by evident worry. "Good evening to you, sir," she replied, her voice carrying a melodic quality despite its undertone of concern. "I find myself in an awkward circumstance. I was to meet my father at this corner, but he has not appeared, and I fear perhaps I have mistaken the meeting place in the confusion of the fog." Thomas nodded with understanding, for he knew well how the fog could transform familiar streets into mazes of uncertainty. "Your father is a merchant, perhaps? I know many of the shopkeepers along these streets, having lit their lamps these 5 years past." "He is indeed a merchant," the young woman confirmed, her expression brightening slightly at this common ground. "James Whitmore is his name. He keeps a small establishment 2 streets hence, dealing in fine fabrics and linens. Do you know of him?" Thomas's memory, trained by years of observing the patterns of the city's nighttime life, called forth an image immediately. Mr. Whitmore, yes, a gentleman of quiet demeanour who often works late into the evening. I have seen his light burning long after other shops have closed for the day. The young woman smiled, though the expression was touched with a hint of sadness. That would be my father indeed. He has been working longer hours of late, trying to... She paused, as if uncertain whether to share more with this stranger who had proven himself kind but was still unknown to her. Trying to meet some difficulty, Thomas applied gently, not from presumption, but from the understanding that came naturally to one who walked the city streets and observed its rhythms. These are hard times for many honest tradesmen, miss. The fog tonight is not the only thing that obscures the path ahead for good people. The young woman regarded him with a look of surprise mixed with gratitude, as if unused to having her circumstances understood so readily. You are very perceptive, Mr. Wickham, miss. Thomas Wickham, lamplighter by profession and by calling, if you'll forgive the presumption of naming it so. He offered a slight bow, the gesture formal yet friendly. I am Eleanor Whitmore, she replied, inclining her head in acknowledgement. And you are correct in your assessment, Mr. Wickham. My father faces certain financial pressures. Nothing dishonourable, I hasten to add, merely the ordinary challenges that come with running an honest business in difficult times. Thomas shifted his pole to his other hand, giving his full attention to this conversation that had blossomed unexpectedly in the fog-shrouded evening. If I might suggest, Miss Whitmore, your father's shop lies but a short distance from here, even through the fog. If you would permit me to light your way, I am travelling in that direction regardless, for there are 3 more lamps between here and there that require my attention. Eleanor's face flooded with relief. Oh, thank goodness. I was beginning to imagine all sorts of unfortunate scenarios. I'm most grateful for your assistance, Mr. Wickham. You have been exceptionally kind. It was my pleasure, Miss Whitmore. I wish you and your father well in navigating the difficulties you face. If honest dealing and hard work can overcome them, then I have no doubt you will prevail. Eleanor hesitated a moment, then spoke with a sincerity that carried clearly through the fog. Mr. Wickham, I wonder, might you pass this way in your rounds again? I often find myself waiting for my father in the evenings, and the fog can be quite disorienting. If our paths should cross again, I would welcome the opportunity to continue our conversation. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of his work. I pass this way each evening, miss, as regular as the clock tower's chiming. If our paths should cross, it would be my honour to provide whatever small assistance I can offer. They parted with mutual expressions of goodwill, and as Thomas watched Eleanor ascend the steps to her father's shop, he felt that the evening had somehow become richer, that his routine rounds had been blessed with an unexpected gift of human connection. He turned back to his work with renewed purpose, the remaining lamps on his route awaiting his attention, and the fog seeming somehow less oppressive, less isolating than it had before. Thomas continued his methodical progress through the city's streets, his pole working its familiar magic as each lamp sprang to life at his ministrations. The fog had grown denser, if such a thing were possible, and he moved through it with the confidence of a sailor navigating by stars invisible to less experienced eyes. Every landmark, every turning, every subtle change in the character of the street spoke to him of his exact location, rendering the fog merely an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. As he approached a lamp standing at the entrance to a narrow alley that connected two larger thoroughfares, Thomas noticed a figure sitting on the steps of a shuttered shop, huddled against the cold and the damp. It was not uncommon for him to encounter such individuals in his nightly rounds, those whom fortune had treated unkindly and who found what shelter they could in doorways and beneath archways. His heart, naturally inclined toward compassion, prompted him to pause in his work and offer what small comfort he could. "Good evening," Thomas called out gently, not wishing to startle the figure. "The night is uncommonly cold. Are you well?" The figure stirred, raising a head that had been bent low, and revealed itself to be an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of a life lived largely outdoors and under difficult circumstances. Yet there was something in his bearing, even in this reduced state, that suggested a past of greater dignity and purpose. His coat, though worn nearly to tatters, had once been a military uniform, and his posture, even seated and clearly exhausted, retained a hint of the soldier's straight-back discipline. "Well enough, sir," the old man replied, his voice carrying the rasp of age and hard living, but also a quality of pride that refused to be entirely diminished by circumstance. "Though I'll admit the damp settles into old bones with troublesome persistence on nights such as this." Thomas approached more closely, his concern evident in his expression. "Have you nowhere to shelter? Surely there must be some place warmer than these cold steps." The old soldier, for such Thomas had now determined him to be, managed a weary smile. "There are places, sir, though not always welcoming to those of us whose fortunes have declined. I served Her Majesty for 30 years, walked from one end of her empire to the other, and now find myself walking these London streets with considerably less purpose, but equal determination to continue standing upright as long as Providence allows." Thomas felt a surge of both respect and indignation, the former for this man's service and dignity, the latter at a society that could allow such service to end in such circumstances. "You served in the military then? In what capacity, if I may ask?" "Infantry, sir. Started as a private and rose to sergeant before my discharge. Saw service in India and Afghanistan, places where the sun burns fierce and the nights grow cold enough to freeze a man's very thoughts. Strange how the cold of London's fog seems to cut deeper than the cold of those mountain passes, perhaps because it carries with it the knowledge that one is home, and yet not truly home." Thomas nodded, understanding more than he could easily express. "Your service should have earned you better than this, Sergeant. It is a shame and a scandal that brave men are left to fend for themselves." The old soldier waved a dismissive hand, though the gesture lacked true conviction. "What's done is done, sir. I do not complain, merely endure, as we were taught in the service. But I thank you for your concern. It's a rare thing these days to have a stranger pause in his work to offer a kinder word." An idea had been forming in Thomas's mind as they spoke, and now he gave it voice. "Tell me, Sergeant, would you accept employment if it were offered? Nothing grand, I fear, but honest work that might provide at least some small improvement in your circumstances." The old soldier's expression transformed, hope kindling in eyes that had grown accustomed to disappointment. "I would accept any honest employment, sir. and be grateful for the opportunity to prove myself worthy of the trust. My own lodgings are modest, Thomas explained, but my landlady is a widow of limited means who maintains a house with more rooms than she can properly attend to alone. She has mentioned more than once her need for someone to help with the heavier work, tending the coal fires, carrying water, managing the small tasks that become burdensome with age. The position would include lodging and meals, and a small wage besides. It is not much, but it would be warm and dry. The old soldier's eyes had begun to glisten, whether from the fog or from emotion, Thomas could not determine. "Sir, if you are in earnest, I would accept such an offer with profound gratitude. I'm not too proud to do whatever work is required, and I assure you I am still capable despite my years." "I am entirely in earnest," Thomas affirmed. "Can you walk? It is perhaps a mile to my lodgings, but I will light your way, and we can speak to Mrs. Pemberton immediately. She is a kind woman who will, I am confident, welcome the assistance and the company." The old soldier rose to his feet, with some effort, but with determination, his military bearing reasserting itself now that hope had been offered. "I can walk it, sir, and gladly. Lead on, and accept my deepest thanks for this unexpected kindness." They set off together, Thomas adjusting his pace to accommodate his companion's stiffened joints and tired limbs. As they walked, the old soldier shared fragments of his story, tales of distant lands and battles fought, of comrades lost and lessons learned. Thomas listened with genuine interest, his own life suddenly seeming less ordinary, less confined to the narrow streets and predictable routines that defined his existence. "What is your name, Sergeant?" Thomas asked as they approached another lamp requiring attention. "William Fletcher, sir, though most called me Will in better days." "Well, Mr. Fletcher, I am Thomas Wickham, and I am pleased to make your acquaintance under any circumstances, even ones such as these. Now, if you'll permit me a moment, I must attend to this lamp, and then we shall continue to Mrs. Pemberton's." As Thomas worked, William Fletcher watched with an expression of quiet contentment. The simple act of watching another man perform his duty somehow restoring to him a sense of purpose and place in the ordered world. When the lamp blazed forth, pushing back the fog and darkness, Fletcher nodded with approval. "A good light, Mr. Wickham. A man can walk with confidence under such a light, knowing his path is clear before him." "That is the hope," Thomas replied. "Though tonight I think we both have found more than merely a clear path. I think we have found the beginning of something better than what the day began with." They continued through the fog-shrouded streets, two men whose paths had crossed in the darkness, and who now walked together toward a future marginally brighter than the one that had seemed inevitable only moments before. And as they walked, the lamps Thomas lit seemed to burn with greater warmth, as if the gas itself responded to the goodness of the deed that had been accomplished. Thomas and William Fletcher arrived at the modest boarding house where Thomas had lodged for the past 3 years. Its narrow facade squeezed between a greengrocer's and a tailor's shop, its windows glowing with the soft light of oil lamps that spoke of warmth and modest comfort within. The house, like many in this quarter of London, leaned slightly to one side, as if weary from bearing decades of weather and the weight of countless lives lived within its walls, yet it stood sturdy and welcoming nonetheless. Thomas knocked upon the door with a familiar rhythm, 2 raps followed by a pause, and then a third, the signal he had long used to announce his return from the evening's work. The door opened promptly, revealing Mrs. Pemberton herself, a woman of perhaps 60 years whose face bore the lines of both hardship and laughter in equal measure. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her apron, though well worn, was spotlessly clean, speaking of her pride in maintaining proper standards despite limited means. "Mr. Wickham," she greeted warmly, then paused as her eyes fell upon his companion. "And you've brought a guest, I see." "Mrs. Pemberton, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I've encountered a situation that I believe might benefit us all." Thomas spoke quickly but respectfully, aware that he was asking something unusual of his landlady. "This is Mr. William Fletcher, a veteran of Her Majesty's service, and I believe he might be the very person you've been seeking to help with the heavier work about the house." Mrs. Pemberton's expression shifted from surprise to careful assessment as she regarded Fletcher, her experienced eyes taking in his worn but dignified bearing, his respectful posture despite obvious exhaustion. She had lived long enough to read character in faces, and what she saw in Fletcher's weathered countenance evidently met with her approval. "A veteran, you say?" she inquired, her tone softening. "My late husband served as well, though he came home safe and sound and lived many good years thereafter. Come in, both of you. Mr. Fletcher, you look half frozen. The kitchen is warm, and there's tea and bread enough for an unexpected guest." The relief that washed over Fletcher's face was almost painful to witness, and he followed Mrs. Pemberton into the house with Thomas close behind. The interior was as modest as the exterior suggested, but everything was clean and well maintained. The furniture solid if worn, the floor swept, the brass fixtures polished until they gleamed. This was a house kept by someone who took pride in her domain, however humble it might be. Mrs. Pemberton led them to the kitchen, a cozy room at the back of the house, where a good fire burned in the range, its warmth wrapping around them like a comfortable shawl. She bustled about, setting the kettle to boil, cutting thick slices of bread from a loaf on the wooden table, and fetching butter and jam from the larder. Her movements were efficient and economical, the result of decades of managing household tasks with practiced skill. "Now then," she said, once they were all seated around the scrubbed wooden table with steaming cups of tea before them, "tell me about yourself, Mr. Fletcher. Mr. Wickham speaks well of you, and I trust his judgment. But I would hear from your own lips what brings you to this circumstance." Fletcher wrapped his hands around his cup, savouring the warmth that seeped through the china into his cold fingers. He met Mrs. Pemberton's gaze directly, his military bearing evident even in his seated position. "I am not ashamed to tell my story, ma'am, though it is perhaps not one to inspire pride. I served 30 years in the infantry, rose to sergeant, and was honourably discharged 5 years past. I received a pension, small but adequate, and found lodgings and work as a watchman at a warehouse. All was well until 18 months ago, when the warehouse burned. My employer, ruined by the loss, could no longer afford my wages. My pension proved insufficient to maintain proper lodgings, and through a series of misfortunes too tedious to recount in detail, I found myself in the circumstances where Mr. Wickham discovered me this evening." Mrs. Pemberton listened with an attention that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When Fletcher finished, she nodded slowly. "An honest telling, Mr. Fletcher. and one that speaks more to the cruelties of fortune than to any fault of your own. I will be plain with you, as I suspect you prefer plain speaking. I do indeed need help with the heavier work about this house. I am not so young as I was, and there are tasks that grow more burdensome with each passing year. Tending the fires, managing the coal, dealing with tradesmen, and various repairs that my late husband once handled with ease. She paused, taking a sip of her tea before continuing. The position I can offer includes a small room on the ground floor, 3 meals daily, and a wage of 5 shillings per week. It is not a generous offer, I know, but it is what I can manage given my circumstances. In return, I would expect reliability, honesty, and a willingness to turn your hand to whatever tasks require attention. Does this interest you? Fletcher's response was immediate and heartfelt. Ma'am, I would accept such an offer with profound gratitude. I assure you of my reliability and honesty, and I am not afraid of hard work. If you will give me this chance, I will prove myself worthy of your trust. Mrs. Pemberton smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her lined face. Then I believe we have an agreement, Mr. Fletcher. Mr. Wickham's recommendation carries considerable weight with me, and you strike me as a man of integrity. We shall consider this a trial period of 1 month, at the end of which we will reassess. Does that seem fair? More than fair, ma'am. You have my word, I will give you no cause for regret. Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with quiet satisfaction, felt a warmth in his chest that had little to do with the tea or the fire. In the space of a single evening, he had helped guide a lost young woman to safety and had provided a desperate man with a chance to rebuild his dignity. These were small acts, perhaps, in the grand scheme of London's vast population and endless struggles, but they were not insignificant to those whose lives had been touched. Mr. Fletcher, Mrs. Pemberton said, rising from the table, let me show you to your room. It is simple but clean, and I think you will find it comfortable enough. Mr. Wickham, thank you for bringing Mr. Fletcher to my attention. You have done a good deed this night. As Mrs. Pemberton led Fletcher away to settle him into his new quarters, Thomas sat alone in the kitchen, finishing his tea and reflecting on the unexpected turns the evening had taken. His rounds were not yet complete. There were still lamps to tend in the eastern quarters of his route, but he allowed himself this brief moment of rest and contemplation, savoring the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a positive difference, however small, in the lives of 2 people who had needed help. The fire in the range crackled softly, its warmth a pleasant companion to his thoughts. Outside, the fog continued its patient work of transforming London into a realm of mystery and shadow. But here, in this modest kitchen, all was light and warmth, and the simple comfort of knowing that the world, for all its hardships and cruelties, still contained the possibility of kindness and connection. When Thomas emerged once more into the fog-shrouded streets, his pole in hand and his satchel replenished with fresh matches, the night seemed somehow less oppressive than it had earlier. Perhaps it was merely the knowledge that 2 souls were now warmer and safer than they had been. Or perhaps the fog itself had begun to thin, though to his experienced eye it appeared as dense as ever. Regardless of the cause, he felt his spirits lifted as he resumed his methodical progress through the city's thoroughfares. The lamps he had lit earlier in the evening continued their faithful vigil, their flames burning steady and bright despite the moisture-laden air. Each point of light stood as a small triumph against the darkness, a beacon for those who might need guidance through the confusing maze of streets and alleys. Thomas paused at each unlit lamp along his route, performing the familiar ritual of raising his pole, opening the small door, and touching flame to gas jet, watching with satisfaction as each new light sprang forth to join its companions in pushing back the night. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to Eleanor Whitmore and the conversation they had shared. There had been something in her manner, a quality of thoughtfulness and sincerity that had touched him deeply. The suggestion that they might encounter each other again on future evenings brought a warmth to his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He was not a man given to romantic fancy, his life being too ordered and solitary to accommodate such complications. Yet he found himself hoping that their paths would indeed cross again, that he might have the opportunity to continue the conversation that had been so unexpectedly pleasant. The church bells tolled the hour, their sound muffled by the fog, but still carrying clearly through the still air. 10 o'clock, the midpoint of his evening's work. With hours yet remaining before he could return to his lodgings and the brief rest that would precede tomorrow's routine. Yet Thomas did not feel weariness, only the steady satisfaction of work well done and purpose fulfilled. He turned into a narrow lane where the buildings pressed close on either side, their upper stories nearly meeting overhead, creating a tunnel-like passage that even in daylight received little sun. Here the darkness was more profound, the need for his lamps more pressing. He attended to each one with particular care, ensuring that the flames burned bright and the glass chimneys were free of soot that might diminish their light. As he worked on the third lamp in this narrow passage, Thomas became aware of voices ahead, raised in what seemed to be heated discussion. His natural inclination was to mind his own business, to focus on his work and avoid becoming entangled in the affairs of others. Yet something in the tones of the voices suggested distress rather than mere argument. His conscience would not permit him to simply pass by without at least determining whether assistance was needed. He approached cautiously, his pole held ready, though not threateningly, and as he drew nearer, the situation became clearer. Two young boys, neither more than 12 years old, stood facing a larger youth of perhaps 16 or 17, whose posture and manner suggested aggression. The smaller boys clutched between them a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and it was evidently this parcel that was the subject of the dispute. "I'll have that package," the older youth was saying, his voice carrying a threatening edge. "Hand it over, and perhaps I'll let you run along without a thrashing." "It's not ours to give," one of the smaller boys protested, his voice wavering between defiance and fear. "It's a delivery for the apothecary, medicine for a sick child. We've been trusted with it." The older youth laughed, a harsh sound without genuine mirth. "All the better reason for me to take it then. Medicine fetches a good price if you know where to sell it." Thomas had heard enough. He stepped forward into the circle of lamplight, his presence announced by the soft tap of his pole against the cobblestones. "Good evening, lads," he said, his voice calm but carrying a note of authority. "Is there some difficulty here that requires resolving?" The older youth spun to face him, his expression shifting from aggression to wariness. Thomas was not a large man, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence, and the uniform of the lamplighter, modest though it was, conveyed official sanction that even street toughs generally respected. Moreover, Thomas's regular presence on these streets had made him a known figure, and his reputation for fairness and kindness preceded him. "No difficulty, Mr. Wickham," the youth said, his tone shifting to one of false innocence. "Just having a word with these boys about proper behavior on the streets at night." "I see," Thomas replied, his gaze steady. "And this word you're having, does it involve relieving them of that parcel they're carrying?" The youth shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that Thomas had witnessed enough to make denial pointless. "It was just a jest, sir. No harm meant." "Then I'm sure you won't mind continuing on your way and allowing these boys to complete their errand," Thomas suggested, his tone leaving no room for argument, despite the politeness of his words. "I'm certain you have better things to do than delay the delivery of medicine to a sick child." For a moment, the older youth seemed to consider challenging this dismissal, his pride warring with his pragmatism, but something in Thomas's steady gaze and unwavering stance convinced him that discretion was the wiser choice. With a muttered comment that might have been agreement or curse, he turned and disappeared into the fog, his footsteps quickly fading into silence. The two younger boys visibly relaxed, their relief palpable. "Thank you, Mr. Wickham," the one holding the parcel said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "We didn't know what to do. We couldn't give him the medicine, but we were afraid he'd take it by force." "You stood your ground admirably," Thomas assured them. "But perhaps it would be wise to complete your delivery quickly and get yourselves home. Where are you headed?" "To Mr. Ashford's establishment on Cripplegate," the boy replied. "It's not far, perhaps 5 minutes' walk." "Then I shall walk with you," Thomas decided. "I have lamps to tend in that direction regardless, and I'll rest easier knowing you've reached your destination safely." The boys accepted this offer with evident relief, and they set off together through the fog-shrouded streets. As they walked, Thomas lit the remaining lamps along their route, and the boys watched his work with interest, asking questions about the mechanisms and the gas and the routes he followed each evening. "How do you remember where all the lamps are?" one boy asked. "There must be hundreds of them." "Practice and routine," Thomas explained. "I've walked these streets so many times that I could likely find my way blindfolded. Each lamp has its own character, its own small peculiarities. Some require a touch more care, others light easily. You come to know them as you might know individual people." They reached the apothecary's shop without further incident, and the boys delivered their parcel to Mr. Ashford, who received it with evident relief and pressed a small coin into each boy's hand as payment for their service. Thomas waited outside, tending to a nearby lamp, and when the boys emerged, he sent them on their way with instructions to travel together and stay in well-lit streets. "Remember," he told them, "there is no shame in seeking help when you need it, and no cowardice in choosing safety over pride. You did well tonight." The boys thanked him once more and hurried off into the night, their voices carrying back to him in fragments of excited conversation about their adventure and their rescue. Thomas smiled to himself and resumed his rounds, the satisfaction of another good deed warming him against the chill. The night deepened as Thomas continued his work. the hours sliding past with the steady rhythm of lamps lit and streets traversed. The fog, which had been so thick earlier, began at last to show signs of thinning, though it did not dissipate entirely. Instead, it transformed, becoming less a solid wall of white and more a gauzy veil through which the city's features could be dimly discerned. Thomas's route took him through varied neighborhoods, from the respectable streets of clerks and shopkeepers to the rougher quarters where poverty pressed close and desperation lurked in darkened doorways. Yet wherever he went, the lamps he lit served the same purpose, bringing light and safety to all who needed it, making no distinction between rich and poor, respectable and disreputable. The gaslight burned impartially, a democratic force in a city sharply divided by class and circumstance. As midnight approached, Thomas found himself in one of the older sections of the city, where medieval buildings leaned at improbable angles and narrow passages wound between them like the tracks of some ancient maze. Here the street names themselves spoke of centuries past. Pudding Lane, Bread Street, Milk Street, names that recalled the trades and markets that had once defined these locations. The Great Fire had claimed much of this area nearly 2 centuries earlier, but some structures had survived or been rebuilt on ancient foundations, and walking these streets felt like moving through layers of history. He was attending to a lamp near the entrance to a small churchyard when he heard the sound of weeping, soft but distinct, coming from among the gravestones. His first instinct was to respect the privacy of grief, for churchyards in the nighttime hours often hosted those seeking solace in mourning. Yet something in the quality of the sound suggested not the grief of bereavement, but rather the despair of present suffering, and his conscience would not allow him to simply walk past without offering what comfort he could. Setting down his pole carefully, Thomas entered the churchyard, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. The weeping grew louder as he approached, and soon he discerned a figure sitting on a wooden bench near an ancient yew tree, hunched over with face buried in hands. As he drew closer, the figure looked up, revealing a woman of middle years, her face streaked with tears and bearing an expression of such profound despair that Thomas felt his heart clench with sympathy. "Forgive me," he said gently. "I do not mean to intrude on your grief, but I could not help hearing your distress. Is there any way I might be of assistance?" The woman looked at him with eyes that seemed to have forgotten hope. "You are kind to ask, sir, but I fear my troubles are beyond the help of strangers, however well-meaning." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, settling himself on the bench at a respectful distance, "but sometimes the unburdening of troubles to a sympathetic ear can ease their weight, even if it cannot eliminate them entirely. I am Thomas Wickham, lamplighter by trade, and I have a few moments to spare if you would care to share what burdens you." The woman was silent for a moment, seeming to debate internally whether to accept this offered kindness. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the hoarseness of prolonged weeping. "I am Mrs. Catherine Hartley, and I am at my wit's end. My husband passed away 6 months ago, leaving me with 3 children to support and no means to do so. I have sought employment everywhere, but no one will hire a woman of my age with the responsibilities I carry. Today I received notice that we must vacate our lodgings by week's end, as I can no longer pay the rent. I came here to pray for guidance, but I fear my prayers go unheard." Thomas listened with growing concern, recognizing in her story the precarious nature of existence for so many in the city, how quickly circumstances could shift from adequate to desperate, how thin the margin was between stability and ruin. "Your situation is indeed grave," he acknowledged, "but not, I think, entirely without hope. Tell me, what work did you do before your marriage? What skills do you possess?" Mrs. Hartley wiped her eyes with a worn handkerchief. "I was a seamstress in my youth, and a skilled one, though I say it myself. I can sew anything from fine garments to practical repairs. But who needs the services of a seamstress burdened with 3 small children?" An idea had begun to form in Thomas's mind, connections being drawn between various threads of the evening's encounters. "I wonder," he said slowly, "whether you might consider a somewhat unconventional arrangement. Earlier this evening, I met a young woman whose father is a merchant, dealing in fine fabrics and linens. She mentioned, in passing, that her father's business faces certain pressures. I wonder whether such a business might benefit from the services of a skilled seamstress, someone who could create samples or make repairs, or even create custom pieces to order. And if the arrangement included a small space where you and your children could lodge, perhaps in exchange for additional services such as minding the shop or managing accounts." He trailed off, seeing the flicker of interest that had sparked in Mrs. Hartley's eyes. "Do you think such an arrangement might be possible?" she asked, hope beginning to edge out despair in her expression. "I cannot promise anything," Thomas cautioned, "but I know where to find Miss Whitmore, and I believe she would at least be willing to discuss the possibility with her father. If you could meet me tomorrow evening at the corner of Cheapside and Martin Lane, I will endeavour to arrange an introduction." Mrs. Hartley grasped his hand with both of hers, her gratitude overflowing. "Mr. Wickham, you have given me the first hope I've felt in months. I will be there, and I pray that something may come of it. Even if nothing does, I thank you for your kindness in listening to a stranger's troubles. We are all strangers until circumstances make us otherwise," Thomas replied gently. "And in a city as vast as London, we must help one another where we can, for who knows when we ourselves might need assistance." They parted with mutual expressions of goodwill, and as Thomas returned to his work, he felt the satisfaction of having possibly planted the seed of a solution to Mrs. Hartley's desperate circumstances. Whether that seed would flourish remained to be seen, but at least he had done what he could, and sometimes that was all one could do. The hours between midnight and dawn were always the quietest of Thomas's rounds, the period when even London's restless energy seemed to ebb, when the streets emptied of all but the most determined travellers and the most desperate wanderers. These were the hours when his work took on an almost meditative quality, the repetitive actions of lighting lamp after lamp, creating a rhythm that allowed his mind to drift and reflect, while his hands performed their familiar tasks with unconscious precision. He thought about the encounters of the evening, the connections he had facilitated, the small acts of kindness he had been able to perform. Eleanor Whitmore and her father's struggling business, William Fletcher and his new position at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, the 2 boys and their parcel of medicine, Mrs. Hartley and her desperate search for hope. Each encounter had been brief, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of London's millions of daily interactions. Yet to those individuals involved. They had mattered profoundly. Thomas had never considered himself a particularly important person. He was a lamplighter, a position neither prestigious nor lucrative, a trade that drew little notice or acclaim. Yet on nights like this, he felt the quiet dignity of his work, the way it contributed to the city's functioning, the safety and comfort it provided to countless people who never gave a thought to the man who ensured their streets remained lit. The eastern sky had begun to show the first faint hints of coming dawn when Thomas lit his final lamp of the night. The fog, which had been his constant companion throughout the evening, had at last begun to disperse, driven away by a gentle breeze that carried with it the promise of clearer weather. As the lamp sprang to life, its flame joining those of all the others he had lit during his long circuit of the city, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. He stood for a moment beneath the final lamp, his pole resting against his shoulder, and looked back along the street he had just traversed. The lamps stretched away in a glowing line, each one a point of light in the darkness, each one a small victory against the night. Together, they formed a luminous pathway through the city, a testament to the power of persistent effort, of steady dedication to a task that never truly ended, but merely paused until the next evening's work began. The distant sound of milk carts and bakers' wagons announced the city's awakening, the beginning of a new day's bustle and business. Thomas's work was done for now, and his own rest awaited him. But before he returned to his lodgings, he allowed himself this moment of quiet reflection, this appreciation for the beauty of what he had accomplished. As he began the walk home, his pole shouldered and his satchel light with the weight of spent matches, Thomas thought ahead to the evening to come. He would meet Mrs. Hartley and attempt to arrange an introduction to Eleanor and her father. He would check on William Fletcher's settling into his new position. He would, as always, tend the lamps that were his responsibility and his pride. And perhaps, if fortune smiled, he would encounter Eleanor again, and they would continue the conversation that had been so unexpectedly pleasant. The lamplighter's work was never finished, only suspended until the next darkness fell. But that was as it should be, Thomas reflected. Some tasks were too important to ever be truly complete, and some purposes were meant to be pursued, not for a final achievement, but for the daily dedication they required. In lighting the lamps each evening, Thomas was not working towards some distant goal, but rather fulfilling a continuous need, providing a service that would be required again tomorrow and every tomorrow thereafter. And there was dignity in that, he thought. There was meaning in work done well and consistently, in duties fulfilled without complaint or expectation of recognition. The lamps would burn through the day, invisible in the sunlight but still ready, still waiting for the moment when darkness fell and they would be needed once more. Thomas turned the final corner that would bring him to his lodgings, his body tired but his spirit content. The dawn was breaking over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, banishing the last remnants of night and fog. But even as the sun rose, Thomas knew that night would come again, as it always did, and when it did, he would be ready to walk the streets with his pole and his matches, ready to bring light to the darkness, ready to serve in the small but essential way that was his calling and his pride. The lamplighter's watch would begin again with the coming evening, as it had begun countless evenings before, and as it would begin countless evenings hence. And Thomas Wickham, Lamplighter of London, would be there to answer that call, steady and reliable as the lamps he tended, burning bright against the darkness, showing the way home for all who needed guidance through the fog-shrouded streets. When Thomas emerged from his lodgings the following evening, his pole in hand and his heart lighter than it had been in many months, the weather had transformed entirely from the previous night's oppressive fog. The sky was clear, allowing the first stars to show themselves in the deepening blue, and the air carried a crispness that spoke of winter's approach, but without the damp chill that made fog so unpleasant. He made his way to the corner of Cheapside and Martin Lane, where he had arranged to meet Mrs. Hartley, and found her already waiting, her expression nervous but hopeful. She had made an effort to present herself as respectably as possible, her dress clean though mended, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. "Mr. Wickham," she greeted him with evident relief, "I feared you might have forgotten, or that I had misunderstood the arrangement." "I never forget a promise, Mrs. Hartley," Thomas assured her. "Now, if Miss Whitmore appears, as I hope she will, I shall make the introductions and explain the circumstances as I understand them. The rest will be for you and her father to discuss." They had not long to wait before Eleanor appeared, walking with her usual purposeful grace, her face brightening when she saw Thomas. "Mr. Wickham," she called out, "I had hoped our paths might cross again. I've thought of our conversation and wished to continue it." "And I as well, Miss Whitmore," Thomas replied. "But this evening I have a matter of some importance to discuss with you, if you'll permit me." He gestured toward Mrs. Hartley. "This is Mrs. Catherine Hartley, a widow recently fallen on difficult times, but possessed of considerable skill as a seamstress. I took the liberty of thinking that your father's business might benefit from her services, and she from the employment." Eleanor's intelligent eyes assessed the situation quickly, understanding dawning in her expression. She turned to Mrs. Hartley with a warm smile. "Mrs. Hartley, I am pleased to meet you. Mr. Wickham's recommendation carries great weight with me, and I believe he may indeed have identified a mutually beneficial arrangement. Would you be willing to come with me now to meet my father? He is working late this evening, and I'm certain he would wish to speak with you immediately." Mrs. Hartley's gratitude was evident in every line of her face. "I would be most willing, Miss Whitmore, most willing indeed." As the two women prepared to depart, Eleanor turned back to Thomas, her expression conveying appreciation and something warmer. "Mr. Wickham, you continue to prove yourself a man of exceptional kindness and practical wisdom. I hope we shall have opportunity to speak more at length soon, perhaps tomorrow evening, if you pass this way in your rounds." "I pass this way every evening, Miss Whitmore," Thomas replied, feeling warmth spread through his chest. "And I would be honored to continue our conversation whenever you wish." They parted with mutual smiles and expressions of goodwill, and as Thomas watched Eleanor and Mrs. Hartley disappear into the early evening, he felt that peculiar satisfaction that comes from having connected people who might help each other, from having served as the catalyst for positive change. He turned to his work, raising his pole to the first lamp of the evening, and as the flame sprang to life, he thought about the invisible threads that connected all the people of the great city, how small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or measure, how one person's simple dedication to doing good work could touch countless lives. The lamp burned bright, pushing back the darkness, showing the way forward. And Thomas Wickham, Lamplighter of London, continued his rounds, steady and faithful, bringing light to the night, one lamp at a time, one evening at a time, one small act of service at a time. For that was his calling, and he fulfilled it with quiet pride and steadfast dedication, knowing that in a world often dark with hardship and sorrow, even the smallest light could make a profound difference. The lamps glowed golden in the gathering dusk, a chain of light stretching through the city streets, a testimony to the simple truth that darkness, however deep, could always be held at bay by those willing to tend the flame. And so the watch continued, evening after evening, lamp after lamp, light after light, steady and sure as the turning of the earth itself, the lamplighter's eternal vigil against the night.